and welcome everyone to today's NRCS Biology webinar. It's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Celeste Mazzacano. Celeste is a staff scientist and aquatic conservation director for the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation, headquartered in Portland, Oregon. She's also the project coordinator for the International Migratory, you can tell where my orientation is, Migratory Dragonfly Partnership, and is editor-in-chief of ARGIA, the new journal of the Dragonfly Society of the Americas. Celeste did her undergraduate and graduate work at the University of Minnesota. She has over 17 years of experience in research, conservation, and education, including conducting invertebrate-based biomonitoring in streams and wetlands, developing surveys, status reviews, and management plans for rare and threatened aquatic invertebrates, and developing and delivering natural resource education and citizen science projects. Celeste says that she's usually found with a net in her hands and up to her knees in water. And if that's true, Celeste, you are the envy of me and I think many of the people in the audience today. So with that introduction, I'll turn it over to you, Celeste.
Thank you all for joining us. Good morning or afternoon to you, as your various orientations may have you. So we're going to cover a lot of ground today, talk about a lot of different aspects of dragonflies, and I want to be able to handle some questions as we are moving through this, and I apologize in advance if I have any technical difficulties that prevent me from answering or doing this properly. But what we'll try to do is, if people are using the notes section to type in questions, I'll try to handle some of those as I'm speaking, and then we'll have time at the end to answer questions as well. And we might stop for some Q&A in the middle, too, for the audio folks, if time permits. So just to give you an idea of what we're going to be talking about today. Before we do that, this is obligatory. As Bill said, I am with the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. For those of you who may not be familiar with that, we are an international nonprofit organization. We're in our 41st year of operation, and people who are familiar with Xerces often think of it in conjunction with butterflies and with pollinators, which is very right and very good, but we also have a thriving aquatic program, and so that's why I have the choice of putting in all these nice aquatic photos here. But we concentrate on the protection of invertebrates and their habitats, and we're one of the few organizations. So this is a little bit of a roadmap for the day. I want to start off with some very basics, just to make sure that you understand the terminology that I'm using, that we're all on the same page. For those of you who are not familiar with dragonflies, and I apologize if this is old hat to some of you, I know some of you may be very well acquainted with their life history. But again, you can't really understand their habitat needs and the conservation threats that they face if you don't know about their life history. So we'll go through their life history, some of the important ecological roles that they play, and I'm going to focus specifically on a couple of different behaviors. There are a lot of different fascinating behaviors, many, many more than just predation and migration. But as Bill mentioned, we are also part of a new initiative called the Migratory Dragonfly Partnership, so migration is certainly part of what we're focusing on here at Xerces. And predation, again, it gets into their ecological roles, roles in mosquito control, roles in structuring wetland communities, macroinvertebrate communities, and communities of higher organisms as well. Talk about their conservation status and needs, and then that will play in very nicely, kind of bringing all of that together and talking at the end about their habitat needs and how the Wetland Reserve Program can factor into that. So that's our plan for the day. So one of the first questions that I'm generally asked is a question that is almost invariably prefaced with, I have a really stupid question. And the question is, what's the difference between dragonflies and damselflies? And I would like to say that's not a stupid question, that's a very basic question. And basic and stupid are not the same thing. It's important to know the difference between them. So to get down to some of the basics, dragonflies and damselflies are both in the order Odonata. And that carries the meaning of toothed, and this refers to the mouth parts of the immature forms, the nymphs, and you'll get to see those in action a little bit further in the presentation. And these are organisms that have been on the planet for a very, very, very long time. So this picture over here, and hopefully I'm using the pointer right so that you can all see. This is a proto-dragonfly, specifically Proto-Lindinia wittii, and it's hard to tell scale from the size of the photo, but this creature had a wingspan of about 6 inches. That sounds pretty impressive, but there are other fossils of Proto-Odonata that have wingspans of 27 inches and more. So these were extremely large insects, the ancestors of dragonflies. But if you compare this fossil to this modern-day dragonfly, hanging up nicely in the shade, they really don't look very different. So they've been present in the fossil record for hundreds of millions of years, and they haven't changed their basic ground plan all that much. So we talk about dragonflies and damselflies. These are actually two different suborders within this larger order, Odonata. And the dragonflies are more formally referred to as Anisoptera, and the damselflies are the Zygoptera. So if you want to know the specifics of what makes a dragonfly different from a damselfly, these are just some representatives here. We've got a common green darner and a sooty dancer. And the names kind of imply dragon versus damsel. Dragonflies tend to have a much larger body. They're larger in size overall, and they're also they're stouter. They're stronger looking. They have a wide abdomen. They have a very stocky thorax where the legs and wings are attached. And the damsels are more slender. They're smaller. Sometimes people say that they're more delicate, although if you've ever seen one in action hunting, I don't think delicate is necessarily the phrase that you would use. But another thing to look at is here at the top of the head. Now, the head of any adult odonate is pretty much dominated by the eyes, but with dragonflies, the eyes actually touch. They form a seam at the top of the head. And there are some types of dragonflies, like the clubtails, for example, where the eyes are a little bit further separated. They nearly touch, but they're very, very close together. In contrast with a damselfly, if you look down at the top of the head, I liken it to looking at a dumbbell or a barbell. You've got kind of a rectangular-shaped head, and the eyes are more widely separated, one at sort of each corner of that rectangle. They also hold their wings differently. Dragonflies keep their wings open when they perch, whether that's hanging up on a tree or down flat on the ground. Those wings are going to stay open. But damselflies will fold their wings along their body. They may hold them a little above the abdomen, adjacent to the abdomen. There's a group called the spread wings that hold their wings a little bit askew, but they fold their wings back over their bodies. And then coming back to the names of those suborders, so the dragonflies are Anisoptera, which basically means unequal wings. And this refers to the fact that the front pair of wings, the forewings, are different in shape than the rear pair of wings, or the hind wings. The hind wings are broader. With the damselflies, these wings are all folded together, and they really overlap nicely. The forewings and the hind wings are the same shape and size. And another little difference is that when the wings join the body, they join at a little stalk or petiole. They're stalked at the base. So those are the basic differences between dragonflies and damselflies. But as I move through this presentation, sometimes I kind of use dragonfly as a generic term or a catch-all term. Pretty much everything that's true of dragonflies will be true of damselflies. Different species, of course, have their different particular characteristics or quirks, but odonates in general I'll be referring to if I say dragonflies. So I want to take you through their life history. Dragonflies and damsels have a lot of really neat adaptations, and the nymphs, the immature forms, are exclusively aquatic, with a few strange and fascinating deviations from some Hawaiian damselflies that can live in leaf litter. But what's shown here is a damselfly nymph. It's head down on a piece of aquatic vegetation. And like any insect, it carries its skeleton on the outside. It has a rigid exoskeleton, and so in order to be able to grow and develop, it has to shed that skin. It has to molt. And each period in between molts is called an instar. So these nymphs, some people call them naiads, some people call them larvae. I'm in the nymph camp. These nymphs will go through multiple stages. Really, overall, the insect spends the majority of its life as a nymph, not as an adult. And depending on the species, they may develop from nymph to adult over a period of months, or it may take a period of several years. The immature forms look an awful lot like the adult forms, except for the fact that, of course, the immatures don't have wings. They live underwater, but as the nymph gets larger and more mature, it starts to develop these little wing pads. And it's amazing to think about to me that those huge, beautiful, sturdy wings of the adult can be folded so very, very well inside these little wing pads, but that is indeed the case. And there's no intervening pupa. These aren't like butterflies where there's a caterpillar and then a cocoon and an adult. Basically, the adult sort of leaps forth from the skin, from the body of that final instar. So how does that happen? Before we get to that, I want to talk a little bit more about how the body plan of these nymphs aids them in their means of hunting and locomotion. It's kind of a nifty thing that in both dragonfly and damselfly nymphs, the way they breathe is also tied to the way they move. So like any small aquatic invertebrate, sure, they can absorb oxygen across their skin, but they also have gill structures. And so up here, this very spidery, spiky-looking creature is a dragonfly nymph. And you can see that what's true for the adults is kind of true for the nymphs as well. The dragonfly nymphs in general look a lot stouter, a lot sturdier, kind of bigger and tougher maybe than the damselflies. And the damselflies are almost fish-like or minnow-like. They have long, slender bodies. Dragonfly nymphs have a gill chamber that is actually internal. You can kind of see the opening of it here. It's a rectal gill chamber. They pull in oxygen by pulling in water into that gill chamber. The tissues in the gill chamber extract the oxygen, and then that water is pretty much waste material, deoxygenated. So they need to squirt it back out again, and this actually provides a handy-dandy means of jet propulsion. And you'll be able to see that in a later video. It allows them to move very, very quickly, much more speedily than these legs could move this strong body. The damselflies have exterior gill structures, and that's what these three little leaf-like or blade-like structures are at the tip of the abdomen here. And they can spread them out, or they can hold them more tightly together. So that's how they breathe, but if they're going to be swimming actively through the water, they'll pull those gill structures together and they'll wiggle the abdomen, and those gill structures will also act as a sort of additional paddle or a propulsion model. So that's kind of a nifty two-for-one mechanism. Development, if you are ever lucky enough to see an adult dragon or damselfly emerging from the final stage nymph, it's an amazing experience, and it's well worth the 45 minutes to hour and a half that you will squat at the edge of a wetland or a stream and watch this happen. I was lucky enough, these photographs are very new. I only recently was able to observe this about a month ago. So what happens is that final instar nymph is starting to undergo some of the changes that are going to be involved in creating the adult body structures. It still looks like a nymph, but it's eventually going to stop feeding. And that's because the mouth parts of the nymph are very, very different from the mouth parts of the adult. And again, you'll get to see those up close and personal later on. And it's also going to switch from being able to acquire oxygen from the water to breathing atmospheric air. And this is because it cannot emerge underwater. If it's underwater, if it's splashed heavily by water, by a wake or a wave, for example, emerging, that emerging adult is going to be swamped and most probably killed. So what these final instar nymphs do is they actually leave the water and they find a good perch to climb up onto. A tree branch, a shrub, rushes, sedges, a bridge abutment, anything that's sturdy enough for them to hook their little claws into. And the adult emergence begins when the skin splits in the thorax of that nymph, what you might think of as kind of between the shoulder blades, right along the back of the thorax. And the first thing that gets pulled out is the adult head and thorax, and of course that's where the legs and the wings are attached. And then that insect is going to rest for a little bit because the legs have to harden up enough to the point where it can lean forward and grab onto the substrate, oftentimes its own nymph skin, and pull out the rest of the body. Now this doesn't look much like a mature dragonfly. These wings are still very small and tiny and crumpled up. The abdomen is very short and stubby, and it looks overall very soft and squishy. They're really vulnerable at this stage, and in fact they are soft and squishy, and they are a favorite food of many birds who like to pluck these off and take them home to their waiting young as a nice little snack. But very quickly, once that insect has pulled free of the nymph skeleton, which is called an exuvia, this brand new adult, which is called a tenorol, is going to start pumping up the wings. So you can see these have already expanded a bit, considerably really, from when it first came out of the nymph skin. It's going to use its bodily fluid, its blood. It's going to pump it through all these different fine little veins in the wings. And when the wings are inflated, that bodily fluid is going to be pumped into the abdomen, and it's going to be used to make the abdomen extend. So here we have the individual that is a lot closer to being what we think of as an adult dragonfly. It's ultimately going to look like this, but it's still very soft. It has shiny wings. To me, I think these wings look like soap bubbles. They have an iridescence, and it's very obvious. You can see it when they're resting or when they're in flight. And it's not a very strong flyer. So it will take off. It's going to leave the water body where it emerged for a while because it needs to mature. This is not a dragonfly that's ready to tango as far as mating and reproduction is concerned. It's also not complete as far as its color development. So a new tenorol adult is going to leave the water, and this process of final maturation is. So you can see that an immature male and a mature male of the exact same species of damselfly can look very different as far as coloration. The colors are very dull when they're younger. They mature to be the bright creatures that we're all familiar with seeing. And in addition, just to make identification even more enjoyable, males and females oftentimes can look very different. So this male blue dasher and this female blue dasher, at first glance, may not even look like they're members of the same species. So there can be a lot of differences between gender and immature versus mature in the way these insects look. Some of them develop an additional coloring called pruinosity. And you can think of this as something akin to the bloom on a plum or a grape. It's a waxy, powdery coating, and it can provide some very striking wing patches. The abdomen or the thorax can become covered with this, and it will wear off as the insect ages. And you can also see that these wings, although they are very strong once they are fully inflated and hardened up, they cannot be repaired, and they take a beating over the insect's lifespan. So older individuals can often have very, very tattered wings, although amazingly enough, they can actually still manage to fly with wings that are in pretty bad condition. So flight is a very noticeable and obvious characteristic of dragons and damsels. They have these huge, amazing wings, and they're even more amazing than they may look because they're able to move independently. And you can see here in this beautiful shot of this black saddlebag that the front pair of wings, of course, is beating in a different place than the hind pair of wings. But each individual wing can also move independent of the others, and this gives them an amazing amount of control. It turns them into incredible aerial acrobats. They can hover, they can shoot up very, very suddenly, they can zigzag and change directions, they can even fly backwards for a short period of time. Some of these dragonflies can cover incredibly long distances, and so some species, in addition to being able to beat their wings and get a lot of distance that way, they have additionally broadened hind wings, and they can use those to glide with. And they can fly just about as quickly, some of them, as small songbirds. Damselflies, of course, being smaller, are not nearly as able to fly with the same power and speed, but they do have the same maneuverability. So I'm going to show a short video right now that just is going to give you a nice slow-motion view of the way these dragonfly wings work in flight. And this very fine control is this little, looks like maybe a meadowhawk, is coming into perch. You can see those wings beating independently, kind of twisting a little bit to gain additional control. So really, really impressive, impressive flight control. And I'm pausing here for a minute because I'm waiting to get, there we go, control back of my slide. So I mentioned that the adults, when they emerge, they're going to leave the water. They need to finish maturing. And what you're going to see coming back to the water first are the males. The males get there, they're going to spend a lot of time patrolling, they're going to establish and guard their territory, and they also want to be on hand to be able to grab the females when they come in, because of course it's all about finding mates. For their part, the females tend to avoid the water until they are ready to mate and lay eggs. Otherwise, they're basically just getting harassed by the males, and, you know, they don't need that. They're going to avoid that. So I have a question that just came in that asked, is all this different type of development seasonal? The answer is yes. I'm running through this pretty quickly, but if you're familiar with, looking at birds and bird guides, you've got the same kind of seasonality for dragonflies and damselflies. In any area, you'll have your early emergers in the spring. Some might be present throughout the season. Some might only show up in the middle of summer. Something like, say, an autumn meadowhawk, that very name tells you that those don't show up until later in the summer and into the fall. So there are different patterns, definitely, of emergence and appearance of these winged adults throughout the season. Okay, sorry, that was not supposed to happen. We have a little glitch in the slides. Not sure why that jump just occurred. There we go, sorry about that. So reproduction is another one of these amazing sorts of behaviors that dragonflies have. So I mentioned that dragonflies and damselflies spend most of their life in the nymph stage. The adults are going to live for a period of weeks to maybe a few months, so certainly they spend much more of their time as nymphs. And as adults, the business is all about hunting and eating and establishing a territory and mating and laying those eggs. But dragonfly mating is a kind of a strange and wonderful and acrobatic occurrence, and what you're seeing here is what's commonly called a mating wheel. So just to orient you, this is the male right here holding the female right behind the eyes. And then this is the female underneath. And you can see that they look like they're kind of joined at the abdomen. So here's what's going on. The males, dragonflies and damselflies, the place where the sperm is produced is not the same place where the sperm is transferred to the female. So before mating can take place, the male actually has to do what's commonly referred to as charging or loading his penis. He has to transfer sperm from the tip of the abdomen where it's made up to the sperm transfer organs, and these are located on the second abdominal segment. Dragons and damsels have 10 segments to the abdomen. They're indicated by the letter S and then the number starting with proximity to the wings, and then segment number 10 is where the clasper structures are located. So he loads up that structure, the secondary genitalia, on the second abdominal segment, and then he's ready to grab the female. And if she's willing, he's going to start out, he's going to grab her with her legs, and then he's going to grab her behind the eyes or behind the head if it's a dragon or a damsel. And these claspers that are at the tip of the abdomen will kind of lock into place with the appropriate species of female. They do make mistakes occasionally and grab the wrong species or even the wrong gender, but those are usually fixed pretty quickly. And if the female is willing, she will then swing her abdomen up so that her genital opening then comes into contact with the male's genitalia. And because it's all about passing your DNA on to the next generation, and because a female is able to mate more than one time, not only do these organs on the second abdominal segment transfer the sperm, they have little hooks and brushes and combs, and they can use those to scoop out sperm from any previous matings that the female did, thereby protecting the paternity and making sure that it is the sperm of this male and only this male that fertilizes that female's egg. So really a crazy kind of dance that these guys do when they mate. Again, depending on dragon versus damsel and the different types of species, the eggs may then be laid in a few different places. They can be laid in vegetation. They can be laid in or on the sediment. They may simply be dropped onto the water. The female can extrude some eggs at the tip of her abdomen and then tap that on the water. Sometimes people see that and they say, oh, that dragonfly is taking a drink. But no, that's how some of the females lay their eggs. And some species will even lay their eggs in the soil in seasonal wetlands that will flood later. So a lot of different adaptations. So what you're seeing here is egg-laying behavior in two different types of damselflies. And so you're also seeing an additional type of behavior here. And it's all, again, about protecting the paternity. The male damselfly is still holding on to the female. They've mated. They're not in kind of sexual contact anymore. But he wants to make sure that no male comes along and mates with that female again. She, on the other hand, in the process of laying eggs, you can see her abdomen, the tip of it right here. She's inserting eggs into that, looks like maybe a piece of rush or sedge. Her body is completely submerged except for the tip of the wings. They can actually stay underwater for some time, and they'll work their way down a plant stem, and they'll lay their eggs as that emergent vegetation becomes submerged. This is a very vulnerable position for the male, as you might imagine, and occasionally you do see a female who's flying around with nothing more attached to her than the abdomen of the male, because his head got nipped off by a hungry bird. So he's a little bit more vulnerable. But this is called contact guarding. The male stays in physical contact with the female. No other male can come along and mate with her while he's there. Some of them will fly along with the female. They let go of her, but they'll circle around her as she lays her eggs, and they'll zoom off to try to scare off any males. And here we see a pair of common green darners, again, still in contact. And you see a really nice view here of this little thorn-like or spike-like structure. That's her ovipositor that she can use to lay her eggs. So the female's going to lay her eggs pretty quickly after mating, and the male is, in some sense, usually going to hang around to make sure that nobody else comes in and messes it. So now that you know a little bit about life history, you've got a bit of a basis to be thinking about, given their life cycle, where they live, how they feed, what sorts of ecological roles can they play. So they're a very important link between not just aquatic food webs, but also terrestrial food webs. Because when you think about odonates, you've got to think about both this obligate aquatic stage, the nymph, as well as this highly terrestrial adult. And yes, they do have to come back to the water to patrol and lay their eggs, but they're out there in the upland and in the marginal vegetation. So they're a very important link between terrestrial and aquatic food webs. And in fishless wetlands, the nymphs can actually be the top predators, and as such, they can really help structure the entire macroinvertebrate community in that wetland. And you'll see this animated in the video later on, but what you're seeing here is the front half of a nymph, and it has used its mouth parts to grab and bring in, this is actually only half of a bug, it's half of a back swimmer bug, and it's in the process of consuming it very quickly. So they're very aggressive, very good, strong predators in the nymph stage. And they're equally good predators in the adult stage. But they're also really, really, really good nutrition. These are big, fat, juicy insects. They're full of fat. They're full of protein. That protein can provide essential amino acids that things like water birds, for example, can't necessarily get from plants and seeds. They're food for a lot of different organisms. I already mentioned that birds really like to snatch up those juicy little soft peniral adults and bring them back to their young. This cedar waxwing is not really a very small bird, but boy, that common green darner is a nice mouthful for it, which might account for the smug look that I always think I see on its face. They're eaten by birds, fish, amphibians, reptiles, mammals. A wide array of organisms will feed on both nymph and adult dragonflies and damselflies. And it's also worth mentioning that because these dragonfly nymphs are such good predators, they're also going to have some risk of bioaccumulation. If you've got a wetland or a stream that's contaminated with pesticides, those nymphs are going to be carrying their accumulated load of contaminant into the upland in the adult form. And so that's just kind of another aspect to think about when you think of water quality and dragonflies and these links between winged aquatic adults and upland wildlife. Because different types of dragonflies and damselflies may have, and often do have, preferences for different sorts of habitats. I'm focusing more on wetlands today because we're talking about the Wetland Reserve Program. Some dragons and damsels prefer to breed in still water. Some will breed in flowing water, including even larger rivers. So you can use dragons and damsels in biotope characterization. Different kinds of habitats will have different characteristic species assemblages. And many of you are also probably familiar with the overall use of aquatic invertebrates in water quality monitoring to indicate the biological health of a stream more generally. And this is also starting to be done in wetlands. So you can look at the entire suite of aquatic invertebrates, but collecting them, sorting them, identifying them, it can be expensive, it can be complicated, it can take a lot of taxonomic expertise. And people began looking at whether or not odonates by themselves can be used as biomonitors, if they can be used as indicators. And studies have shown that they do change. The odonate community changes in abundance as well as in species composition in response to human disturbances. So they can also be used as biomonitor indicators. Something that's a little bit newer that's also the focus of a citizen science project is using dragonfly nymphs as a means to detect and assess levels of mercury contamination. This was done as a pilot project, I think just a few years ago. Instead of having to sample fish, for example, and look at fish tissue accumulated mercury load is, could you do the same thing using dragonfly nymphs? That pilot project was a success, and this has now been launched as a citizen science project through the National Park Service. So heavy metal contamination, mercury contamination in aquatic ecosystems, this is another use, another role that these organisms can play. And then last but definitely not least, this has been done a little bit more in Europe than it has in the United States, but the headlines that you see here, these are just journal titles from a smattering of different studies that have been looking at changes in range and in breeding populations of odonates that are related to the effects of climate change. So they can also be used as model organisms to study climate change effects. So those are some of the ecological roles. I want to focus for a little bit now on some of the specific behaviors. And again, this all kind of ties into their habitat needs, to their role in different kinds of aquatic habitats. And I've been harping on the fact that odonates are really mighty fine predators. And I mentioned earlier under the basics that the name odonata means toothed. Well, this is really illustrated quite well in the mouth parts of the nymphs. So what you're looking at here is the underside of the head of a dragonfly nymph. And this is actually what you might think of as its lower lip. It's called the labium. And when it's not in use, it has a little hinge, or like a little elbow joint, and it can be folded away neatly underneath the head. But if you look at the tip of it, you can see that it is armed with some wicked sharp teeth, and there can be additional teeth and fangs, basically, that are associated with this structure. So if you look at the way the body of a dragon or a damselfly is, and if you're at all familiar with looking at, say, predatory bugs, oftentimes predatory insects will have really strongly developed legs, almost like they're pumping iron. Well, dragon and damsel nymphs have fairly spindly little legs, and that's not really where their catching and seizing power is located. It's really in this incredible extendable mouth part, and they can shoot this mouth part out use those teeth at the ends to grab their prey. They can grab prey that's even larger than they are. And then equally quickly, it's brought right back to the head where the chewing parts of the mouth are. And they can process that prey really, really. Now, they are generalist predators. They will feed on a variety of different aquatic invertebrates. They will eat tadpoles. There are some studies here in Oregon that have indicated that in wetlands that do not have non-native fish, that dragonfly nymphs can actually keep populations of invasive bullfrogs under control because they're that good at eating the tadpoles. They can even prey on small fish. So generalist predators, and the behavior is a really, really neat thing to see. So we're going to show you just part of a video clip here that shows a dragonfly nymph that's actually been placed in an aquarium, and it's hunting bugs called backswimmer bugs. So here you can see it. It is kind of crawling through the habitat, but this is a beautiful, beautiful illustration of that gill behavior. You can see that the abdomen is pumping. It's actively bringing oxygenated water into that rectal gill chamber. Does a couple of push-ups here to get ready to move, and then it uses that jet propulsion to just shoot right out of the frame of the video, faster than you can even see. So those legs are just trailing along next to it. The power of that movement is coming from that jet propulsion. So it'll make a snap at that fish that's a little bit bigger than it is. Couldn't even see that mouth part being extended until you get to the slow motion. So the whole body isn't really leaping after the prey. That extensible mouth part is going to do the grabbing and the catching. And again, you can see it in slow motion. And when it's retracted, in this particular type of dragonfly, that almost forms like a little mask-like covering of the face when that mouth part is retracted. So it's going to keep on snatching again. You see that extension, and then it comes back to the face. We're not going to watch the rest of this video. We're going to end it here, but just so the suspense doesn't kill you, it does, in fact, eventually make a successful grab at one of those backswimmers, and it munches it up in really, really short order. Touches predators, and so are the adults. But the adults, as I said, don't have that extensible mouth part. They don't have that lower lip that can shoot out. Instead, when you look at the head, it's really dominated by the eyes, and that's true for both dragon and damselflies. They're very highly visual hunters, and you can see from just the shape of these eyes that even without moving their heads, they've got almost a 360-degree field of vision. And in fact, if you look at a perched dragonfly, you'll oftentimes see it kind of making little small movements of its head, looking around, making those adjustments to be able to see everywhere around it. They can see color, they can see movement, they can see shape. They have very sophisticated vision, so definitely very much visual hunters. And I apologize for some reason. After the video, I keep on shooting back to the opening slide, so give me just 1 second to find my place here. As I said, there are going to be some technical difficulties. There we go. Sorry about that. So they don't have that extensible mouth part. They've got great vision, good, that's fine, that helps them see their prey. But what are they going to grab their prey with? Well, when they're flying around and they hunt in the air, if you take a look at this damselfly and you can see the legs, they're just covered with tiny little spines and spikes and hairs. And when they fly, those legs are held directed forward, kind of like a spiny basket. And they can scoop up prey. If it's a small prey item, they can actually just use their legs to bring it right to their mouths, and they can eat it in midair. If it's a larger prey item, they will land with it, and they will eat it. And as you can see here, they're not above engaging in a little bit of cannibalism either. So I said they're generalist predators. They'll feed on anything they can basically get their mouth parts on. But they're also a very important part of a suite of natural enemies that can help control mosquitoes. Now, both the nymphs and the adults will eat mosquitoes. Obviously, the nymphs will eat mosquito larvae. The adults will eat adult mosquitoes. But in any kind of a wetland situation where you've got a healthy system, you'll also have immature and mature predaceous beetles and bugs like those backswimmers that you saw in that video. They're very, very good at colonizing a wetland and really chowing down on mosquito larvae. Salamanders and frogs, both as tadpoles and adults, are able to help control mosquitoes. So, you know, sometimes I get emails from people that ask about, oh, well, should I, you know, there are supply companies. I can buy dragonfly nymphs, and I can buy those and put them in my wetland and use those for mosquito control. And the answer is, oh, Now, number one, those aren't necessarily native species to your area. You don't know if they're coming with any diseases. If you dump too many of them in the wetland, they may feed on other organisms. You may have more than the system can support. But a healthy wetland is going to support a good variety of natural enemies. In some cases, they may merely help suppress mosquito populations, but in some cases, they may very well control mosquito production at that site. So very handy predators from our point of view. Another behavior that is substantially less well known than the predatory behavior of odonates is annual migration. And of course, when people think about migration in insects, they think, oh yeah, monarch butterflies, they migrate really long distances. Well, it comes as a surprise, generally, to a lot of people that dragonflies actually migrate as well. And they can be just as regular and annual in their migration as those monarch butterflies. Now, the phenomenon of migration in dragonflies is not something brand new. There have been observations and casual reports of it, and more formal reports of it as well, all the way back to the 19th century. And this is actually a really good time of year. People have already reported seeing huge swarms of a kind of dragonfly called the swamp darner moving down through the East Coast. Migration generally starts in North America in late July, early August, and it can continue through September or October, early October. So people can see thousands or even tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of dragonflies moving south in the fall in these gigantic migratory swarms. Now, not every species migrates. First of all, damselflies don't have the ability, they don't have the strength, they don't have the oomph to engage in long-distance migrations. But a handful of the species that we have in North America are known to be regular migrants. The 5 that you see here are the ones that are considered to be the most regular in their migratory behavior. The common green darner, spot-winged glider, wandering glider, and this has been documented in India and Africa as covering tens of thousands of miles across open ocean. The variegated meadowhawk and the black saddlebag. So these are the most regular annual migratory species that we have in North America. But as many as 11 more may also be migrants, not on as regular a basis. There may be years that go by without any migratory behavior being seen, and then you may get one year that's just a gigantic eruptive migration year. So meadowhawks tend to show a lot of migration behavior, so do different saddlebags. This skimmer may actually be much more of a regular migrant. We are getting reports from the east that this is one that they see on a very regular basis. This is the swamp darner that I talked about that's already been seen moving south along the east coast. So we may have as many as 16 species, maybe more. This hasn't been investigated in as much detail as is needed, that are migratory in North America. Why should we study migration in these individuals? Well, for one thing, their migration is tied to the migration of birds. And people who see, for example, Mississippi kites that are moving down south through North America, they oftentimes see things like common green darners that are moving at the same time, and you'll see those birds that are feeding on these dragonflies. And these dragonflies have probably eaten a lot. They've pumped up their fat content. It may be a very important source of nutrition for those migrating birds because they share a lot of the same migration routes. So that's one aspect of odonate migration which is of interest. And the other thing is there's a ton of questions that we have about it. You know, right now we're probably about at our level of knowledge where monarch butterfly people were maybe 10 or 15 years ago. So, you know, the question has been asked, why do odonates migrate? That's a really good question. Certainly, for the species that do it, it must give them some sort of an adaptive advantage. I should mention that all of those species that I mentioned as regular or sometime migrants, they are wetland associated, and they are fairly common and widespread species. It kind of makes sense if you're engaging in migration. But we don't know exactly what their triggers are to move to the south or to come back up north in the spring. We don't know where their overwintering grounds are or exactly how far south they go. You know, monarch butterflies are great. They hang up in glittering clouds in groves of trees, and you can go and count them and mark them. That doesn't seem to be the case at all for the dragonflies. And you can see 10,000 of them in the sky, and migration stops, and you ask yourself, where did they all go? They're not all sitting in one wetland waiting for you to come find them. In some species, like the common green darner and probably the black saddlebags as well, the nymphs may follow two different routes. They may grow up very quickly in the summer, emerge as adults, and then fly away, not hang around and mature, but head on that journey south. But some of the nymphs may develop more slowly and go through the winter at that site in that wetland, undergoing a period of hibernation or diapause. So we don't know what causes sort of the choice, the trigger between lifestyles. What's the importance of habitat connectivity? These are wetland-dependent species. As wetlands continue to disappear or become degraded, is it going to affect dragonfly migration? Well, we won't know that until we know a lot more about migration. What causes the difference between sporadic migrants and annual migrants? What are the navigation cues that they use? Similar to monarch migration, we have another question that just came in that asked if migration involves multiple generations. Based on what we know about the lifespan of adult dragonflies, and I said they live for anywhere from weeks to a few months, it is very likely that in this way they are similar to monarchs. The generation that flies to the south and overwinters is not the same generation that comes back up north in the spring. So we think that there is another generation that is being produced down in those wintering grounds, but again, we need to do more investigation to be absolutely sure of it. So in order to be able to study this better, Xerces, as well as several other international partners, have formed the Migratory Dragonfly Partnership, a collaboration among a lot of different nonprofit organizations, federal agencies. We are funded through U.S. Forest Service International Program, so Bill, there's your bird connection with the migration. And our basic goal is to understand and conserve dragonfly migration in North America. And we're a pretty new group. This is just a screenshot of the website. But we're aiming at getting the information we need via a variety of different citizen science projects. So one of those focuses just specifically on migration, and that's the flights south in the fall as well as the return north. More place-based type of observations that we're calling pond watch, and then people who are interested can also collect adults as well as nymphs and contribute those to isotopic analysis to be able to see, for example, if you capture an adult, how far away from its wetland of origin did it fly at the point at which it was captured. So those are the three main projects that we're using to investigate dragonfly migration. This map shows you where some of our records are that are coming in. 2012 was really our first year of operation. We had a little bit over 219 folks registered. In the first half of this year, by the first half of this year, we've almost doubled that number of users, and you can see we've got some gaps, especially in the west here, and we need to get some more folks in Mexico and Canada, but we're very optimistic that these reports are going to continue to come in. We've recently begun working with the Hawk Monitoring Association of North America. Even as we speak, there are trainings going on to hawk watchers about how to do dragonfly counts because they have changed their database to make dragonfly migration monitoring a formal part of Hawkwatch, and we are very, very excited about that. We're going to get great information that we just couldn't get any other way. The NDP is also using the phenomenon of dragonfly migration as an additional way to promote conservation of the habitat that these odonates need. So we're trying to promote protection, conservation, and restoration of wetlands. And I mentioned that these migratory species, they're pretty common, they're pretty widespread. They are not necessarily at risk any more than any freshwater-dependent organism is at risk. But there are an awful lot of odonate species out there that are facing multiple threats, that are declining, that do need more conservation attention. And so we're also hoping to be able to focus more attention on those particular species. So that gives me a nice little segue into the topic of odonate conservation. How are dragonflies and damselflies doing in the big picture? Well, some of you may be familiar with this diagram from a study that was done by the Nature Conservancy some years ago now. And what it's basically showing is the proportion of all the described species of plant and animal groups in North America that are at risk. And that at risk is anywhere from already extinct through different levels of impairment and then up into vulnerable. So one of the first things that you notice is that the top 5 are all freshwater dependent. Freshwater is kind of a problem. Dragons and damsels are in the top 12. This number of 18% of all species is a little bit out of date by now. It's probably at least 20%. But another interesting thing to notice is that mammals are here at 16% being threatened, 14% of the bird species threatened, reptiles very close at 18%. And if you think about the degree of conservation attention that's focused on mammals and birds, entirely deservedly, but dragons and damsels are not getting that same amount of attention. It's not because they don't need it. So let's take a little closer look at the numbers here. There are a little less than 6,000 odonate species globally, and we're pretty well represented here in North America. Not quite 10% of them, but we've got about 463 species in North America. These numbers to some extent are moving targets because new species are still being described, but a pretty substantial number of those are at some level threatened in the United States and Canada. These numbers here just kind of give you the breakdown of those 89 species, how many are vulnerable all the way through to extinct. And if you want to think about federal protection, right now under the United States Endangered Species Act, there are 6 odonate species listed. Hines emerald was put on the list in 1995. It's a dragonfly. And it was alone until about 2 years ago when 5 species of damselflies that are known only from Hawaii, they're all in the genus Megalagrian, were finally moved off the candidate list and listed as endangered. The Canadian Species at Risk Act has the rapids clubtail listed. What are the threats that odonates face? Well, again, you could probably take this photo of this very handsome pennant dragonfly and you could replace it with anything that lives in fresh water. You could put in a fish, you could put in a mussel, you could put in a duck, because all of these different things are factors that affect you if you rely on fresh water. So fragmentation and the loss and degradation of habitat, contamination from heavy metals, pesticides, thermal contamination, heated runoff from paved surfaces, unregulated grazing, hydrologic alterations, nutrient enrichment, and of course, global climate change. So all of these are threats that different species of odes are facing to a greater or lesser extent, depending on their particular habitat needs and location. We here at the Xerces Society know a lot about the challenges of trying to conserve and protect odonates and insects in general. And one of the biggest problems is that insects in general are simply not considered to be charismatic megafauna, an attitude that I find quite baffling. But we consider them to be charismatic. And I would argue that probably after butterflies, odonates may be the most charismatic insects that we have. And so they can also be used as a pretty good poster child for insect conservation as a whole. But because they're not so charismatic, they're not so well known. People don't have the appreciation and understanding they have of the roles that they play in freshwater ecosystem. And there's a lot less public awareness. So I like to use this. I'm always very interested in what they call, I think it's called non-personal interpretation, the signage at parks and refuges and things like that. So this one seemed promising to me, the wildlife of freshwater wetlands. That was very exciting. And it's a very nice sign, and you look at it, and you can see amphibians, and you see birds, you can see water birds, shorebirds, songbirds, you got some mammals that are thrown in here. But the one thing that is absolutely missing from the sign is the one group that every single one of these organisms depends on as food. You don't see any insects. You don't see any dragonflies, certainly a very obvious component of the wildlife of freshwater wetlands. So awareness is a huge problem that we continue to struggle with. I mentioned earlier that the number of species that we have is a little bit of a moving target. Many species are still undescribed. So this graph here, this is from a paper that was talking about global diversity of dragonflies in fresh water, and it's showing the rate of description of new taxa, new species of dragons and damsels. And you can see that they kind of hit their golden age here in the early 1900s, but as we move on into the 1990s and into 2000, these numbers have not really dropped off that much. It's not like we've described everything there is to describe. Even right here in North America, this is a photo of a dragonfly that was described in 2011. So this species is very, very new to the odonate world, and it's called the Sarracenia spiketail. It is highly restricted in its habitat. It is found only in wetlands that are in longleaf pine savannas, and they need to have a particular type of pitcher plant, Sarracenia alata, which is called the pale pitcher plant. They're only found on the wing from about mid-March to mid to late April, so they're not the most obvious of species, and right now it's only known from 5 counties in East Texas and one adjacent parish in western Louisiana. So there are still a lot of new species out there with their own habitat needs and threats and risks. There are still a lot of gaps, although you may think of odonates as a pretty well-studied group. We still know everything there is to know about their specific life histories and needs. And another issue is that many states actually don't assign odonate species of greatest conservation need. In 2010, there were 15 states that did not have any odonate SGCN. If they aren't assigned as species of greatest conservation need, they don't make it into the state wildlife management and protection plans, and so again, their status and their threats and their needs is passing right underneath the radar, and you run the risk that if and when conservation attention is brought to bear on them, populations may have declined past the point where they are able to recover. So what are some strategies to bring to bear for odonate conservation? Well, of course, you want to map the essential habitat. That's important for any organism. And you need to know what's the current and the historic distribution. That can be a bit of a challenge, especially the historic distribution. You may have a museum, a university museum that has really, really good records, and you can get an idea of where the species used to be found and how much its range has shrunk, but that's not necessarily always the case. So this particular diagram here is taken from a paper study that was done looking at areas that contributed groundwater to the habitat that's used by our endangered dragonfly, Hines emerald. Now, this is another real habitat specialist. You only find it in spring-fed marshes and sedge meadows that are high in calcium carbonate and overlie dolomite bedrock. There is not an abundance of this, and much of the previous habitat has been drained and filled for development. So in addition to the springs and marshes themselves, you need to think about protecting the groundwater. And so that's, for this particular species, what was one of the things that was necessary for thinking about its conservation and protecting its habitat. Fill in those knowledge gaps that I mentioned and get protection for threatened species. This doesn't necessarily mean a listing under the Endangered Species Act. It may be something as simple as figuring out what the biota is of a certain county or stream or wetland and being able to address specifically threats at the watershed level, whether that's development or riparian buffer zones. It may be as simple as fencing cattle out of a wetland or changing a grazing schedule. So it doesn't always just mean endangered species protection. You can get a lot of protection working with state and federal agencies within a state or with a county or a national forest or something. And, of course, all that information goes into developing recovery and management plans that can be put into work on the ground. And, of course, overall, protect, conserve, and restore aquatic and upland habitats. And so if we're talking about wetland-dependent species, that makes a very nice segue into what are the particular habitat needs of these wetland-dependent odonates and how can the Wetland Reserve Program play into that. So one thing to be aware of is that many wetland-dependent odonates will very readily exploit restored or artificial habitats. One of those endangered species of Hawaiian damselflies that I talked about, it was actually thought to have been completely extirpated from the islands, and then a population of it was found breeding in a drainage ditch on an army base. So not what you might think of as the most pristine or wonderful habitat, probably not the most ideal habitat, but it was hanging on there. People will report seeing odonates visiting their backyard ponds almost as soon as the pond is installed. So they're very good at using restored or artificial habitats. But you also need to know enough about their habitat needs to prevent a site that's being visited from basically becoming a reproductive sink. That the odonates come, they mate, they lay their eggs, and then those eggs cannot develop, those nymphs cannot develop successfully into adults. And so this diagram, or this photo that you see, this is an agricultural wetland. It's an ag pond, and it shows a few things that are good for dragonflies and a few things that are not so good for dragonflies. So you can see that there's emergent vegetation here. This is actually a fair bit of smartweed. There's some algae problems. And the stand of cattails over here, I don't know if you can see that there's a good flush of purple in there. This site was recently invaded by purple loosestrife, which unfortunately the landowners did not know was an invasive species, and they thought it was a nice ornamental, so they've encouraged it. The vegetation has been mowed right to the edge. There's very little marginal vegetation, definitely not good for dragonflies. And off to the side here is where the ag fields are. There's really not much of a buffer to filter any of the runoff that's going to be coming into this site. But there were plenty of dragonflies hanging around in the site. Males were patrolling. Females were coming in to lay their eggs. The site was also full of mosquito fish, and I'll talk about the fact that gambusia are not very good things for a thriving community of odonate and aquatic invertebrates in general. So if you make it, they will come, but you want to make it the best possible that you can so that you don't get them turning into basically just reproductive things where you don't get good odonate production. So what are the basic needs of your average dragonfly or damselfly? These are tied together, but I'm going to talk about water, food, vegetation, and places to lay your eggs. So when you talk about water, there are a few different considerations here. I've got duration, depth, abundance, quality, and disturbance. So duration, if you think about a temporary versus a permanent wetland, You will have different species that are able to exploit temporary wetlands. I mentioned there are some dragonflies that lay their eggs in dry sites that will actually flood later. But you'll get different communities coming into your wetland if it retains water throughout the season or most of the season, as opposed to if it dries down very quickly in the spring. Water depth at a site is important, and you want to have a variety of depths. The shallows that are going to be found more around the margins here, these are going to warm up more quickly. That's good for the nymphs to be able to warm up and to be able to get about their hunting a little bit faster. Deeper water, closer to the center, and by deeper, it doesn't really have to be much more than a couple of meters deep. It's going to be cooler, so it can provide a refuge when those shallows warm up. The nymphs can head to the cooler areas. Cooler water will also hold more dissolved oxygen, so that improves the water quality. And if you have areas that don't freeze solid, then that's also a place where some of these dragonflies that develop over more than one season, and some species may develop anywhere from 2 to 5 years. They may spend that long as a nymph. They can find refuge there, and again, they can survive, they can go into hibernation, and that water won't freeze solid over them. By abundance, what I really mean is abundance of wetlands in the landscape. So especially if you have a new site, wetlands that are very isolated in the landscape, if you think about corridors and habitat fragmentation, they simply won't be colonized as quickly. So if you've got other wetlands that can serve as sources of odonates within about 3 miles, colonization will be fairly rapid. If your wetlands are more isolated, then you're not going to see dragonflies as quickly, and you may not see as diverse a community as well. Water quality, there are some species of dragons and damsels that are a little more tolerant of pollution. But of course, if you have a lot of runoff, that's going to have an effect on what dragons and damsels are able to survive there. Excessive fertilizer runoff, of course, can cause nutrient enrichment. That can cause algal blooms. And while some damselflies, for example, will happily lay their eggs in little patches of floating algae, too much algae is going to have an effect on water quality. It's going to have an effect on the amount of dissolved oxygen, and so that's going to be a negative. And then disturbance. Sometimes people will use pumps or filters to be able to oxygenate the water, and that can be good, but be aware that if you don't have some sort of protection around that pump, it can actually suck in odonate nymphs and kill them. Again, with something like trampling livestock, they can actually kill nymphs and teneral adults. They can reduce the plant cover. They can decrease the water quality. So lots of different aspects of water, obviously, that impact these organisms. What about food? They're not going to hang around very long if they don't have food as adults. You will get poor production, poor survival of nymphs to the adult stage, and you may get morphological abnormalities. They may not be able to develop into normal adults without enough food because they eat a lot. So again, you need to think about aquatic food sources and terrestrial food sources, satisfy the needs of the nymphs and of the adults. Of course, as I said, the adults can fly away and find better hunting grounds, but the nymphs are pretty much stuck where they are. So be aware that if wetlands are stocked with fish in particular, this can really decrease odonate production site. Now, that's not to say that you won't find odonates successfully living and breeding in wetlands that do have fish, but I have seen wetlands that have been absolutely teeming with gambusia, the so-called mosquito fish, and you can get very, very decreased production of odonates out of those wetlands. You need to have a good prey base for the nymphs in order for them to be able to survive, and so this always comes down to the question of pesticide use and mosquito control. And of course, there are a lot of different things out there, organophosphate pesticides that can be used against mosquitoes, pyrethroids. These have known effects on non-target aquatic insects and aquatic organisms. A lot of the developmental disruptors, things like methoprene and juvenile hormone analogs, those affect a broad range of invertebrates, and so they too can affect not just the nymphs themselves, but also their prey base, and even something like Bacillus thuringiensis. It doesn't just kill mosquitoes, it kills all the true flies in the habitat. So that means no crane fly nymphs, that means no non-biting midge nymphs, and those can be a huge proportion of the biomass. So if a wetland is being treated on a very regular scheduled basis with something like BT, again, it can decrease the prey base for those nymphs, and it can decrease the production out of the site. Vegetation. Now, unlike something like a caterpillar, where you think of them as having certain kinds of host plants that they need to use, the specific species of plant at a site, with very few exceptions for a few different odonate species, is not nearly important as diversity of plants that create a good structural complexity of plants. And there's a question that just came up that's asking, so that odonates disperse away from the wetlands, and do we know anything about how the uplands are being used? Absolutely, and this is one of the places that I'm going to talk about that. So if we start kind of going from the wetland and working out to the margins and into the uplands, you want to have a good variety of submerged and emergent and floating and marginal and upland vegetation as well. So again, you can't forget about your upland. So why do they need all this different diversity? What is all this different plant doing? Well, the submerged vegetation is going to provide nymph habitat, and that is going to be a refuge because, of course, if there are other predators around, like tadpoles or fish that want to eat those nymphs, they won't be able to find them quite as easily in the vegetation. And in fact, coming back to mosquito control, those nymphs can hide in the vegetation, but they can also hunt in submerged vegetation. And mosquito fish perform substantially more poorly in heavily vegetated sites. Dragonfly and damselfly nymphs, they can hunt in that submerged vegetation. So that's another little benefit there of having those odonates in the wetland. But they can use it for refuge. And, of course, the submerged plants are going to increase water quality by producing oxygen. The emergent and marginal vegetation, remember that those nymphs need to have a surface to climb up out of the water and hold on to when they emerge. So they can do that on emergent vegetation. They can do that on the marginal vegetation at the edges. So you want to have good emergent sites. And sometimes people that have a brand new site that doesn't really have much emergent or marginal vegetation, they'll put in stakes, like bamboo stakes, to provide basically emergent sticks and perching sticks until the plants in the wetland develop a little bit better. Adults can also use that emergent and marginal vegetation. They can perch on it, they can roost, they can fly out and do their patrolling flights back and forth from it, and they can also lay their eggs in it, because remember, some species will actually insert their eggs into vegetation, and that might be floating or emergent or submerged vegetation. And, of course, this floating vegetation also makes a nice perch to rest on and to cool off on. When it comes to the upland areas, this little inset here, it looks kind of dark and dim, and you just see the outline of some dragonflies. It looks dark because it was taken at dusk, and I was at a river, and I was walking along, and I thought, well, it's getting kind of late. I'm really probably not going to see much in the way of dragonflies. And then I looked up, and I saw that this tree that was maybe, 5 feet away from the water's edge was covered in little dashers, dragonflies, that were coming in to perch. So they were going to roost there for the night. So the upland vegetation, and whether you're talking about shrubs and forbs that are a little bit closer to the site, whether you're talking about the trees, you don't usually equate trees with good dragonfly habitat, but trees that are further up in the upland provide shelter. That can be shelter from predators, from the heat. They need to cool off in the heat of the day. They have certain behavioral mechanisms they can use, but they can also go take refuge in the trees. They can rest there, they can mature, they can hunt in the area, they can shelter from wind, and they can shelter from storms. So trees in the upland are really, really important. You just want to make sure that you don't have too much shading from trees at the edge of the water. It can prevent those shallows from warming up enough. And when the leaves fall into the water, they can also foul the water, and as they decompose, you can end up with decreased oxygen levels. So plants, structural diversity, structural complexity, and all the way on into the upland. Don't forget about your upland. For egg laying, for oviposition, I went through the fact that they will lay their eggs in floating plants and submerged plants, in emergent vegetation, and there are some species of darners, which are one type of dragonfly, that will actually also lay their eggs in rotting logs. So you might want to have a little bit of woody debris at a site as well. And of course that can be used, for example, as basking habitat by turtles. A lot of what's good for odonates is also good for other native wildlife like fish or salamanders or turtles. So you get kind of a multiple bangs for the conservation buck there. So I would be happy to talk about any of this stuff in more detail with anybody who is listening. We'll have a question and answer session in just a couple of minutes. You can email me directly if you would like. But I would say just kind of in summation, the Wetland Reserve Program and wetland restoration can provide a great many benefits to odonates, providing quality habitat in a disappearing landscape. And that's due both to wetland destruction and degradation, and with climate change, the freshwater landscape is changing mightily, and it's going to continue to change. And we make the organisms as resilient as possible and give them as many sites as we can. and that goes into habitat connectivity. When there are more wetlands within an area, there's greater movement of not just odonates, but a lot of the different winged predators like predatory bugs and beetles. They facilitates movement and colonization between sites. It facilitates genetic exchange between sites. Some of those populations of that endangered Heinz emerald are rather more isolated in the landscape from each other, and people have seen some genetic differences between those populations. So keeping connectivity, making it easy to move, to colonize different sites, all of this is going to help sustain diverse, abundant, resilient species assemblages. But then I would also say that odonates provide substantial benefits to WRP, to any wetland conservation program. We talked about the fact that they are important food for both aquatic and upland wildlife, the birds, the bats, the amphibians, all the fish and things, wetland birds that live in the water. They have their role in helping to suppress or control or even eliminate mosquito populations, and of course that is going to vary on a site-by-site basis. Dragonflies are not the magic bullet that is going to cure all your mosquito problems, but they're certainly a very important part of the suite of natural enemies that helps contain them. They can be used in biomonitoring and bioassessment, and I would say, too, that it's an additional form of wildlife, and it's an additional aesthetic benefit to people who are enrolled in the program. You know, people, I think, in general, respond very positively to dragonflies, and even more positively when they find out that they do things like eat mosquitoes and deer flies and things like that might be tormenting you. So it's another very good, obvious type of wildlife that people could say, boy, I used to only see maybe one or two types of dragonflies or no dragonflies at all, and now I see them all the time at my site, and that's really a cool thing. So I think that brings us to the end, and we will open it up for questions.
Once again.
No, we have some of these in the notes, and I guess there's going to be some audio questions as well. Is that right, Emily?
That is correct. Once again, if you'd like to ask a question, you can dial *1 on your phone to put yourself into the queue. You'll hear a notification when your line is unmuted, at which point you can state your name and your question. You can also use the raise hand button to put yourself into the queue. If you'd like to send a note, please send it to all moderators.
So I answered a few of the questions that people had typed in as notes as I was speaking, but we have a few more that I didn't manage to cover. One question is, what types of mosquito control are compatible with maintaining good habitat for odonates? Xerces actually recently published a guide, a report with recommendations to ecologically sound mosquito control in wetlands. We don't necessarily recommend the control of what are referred to as nuisance biters, mosquitoes that will bite you, but they cannot transmit any diseases. But I understand that those can also, of course, harass livestock. People can see their yields go down if there's a lot of annoyance to their cattle, for example. So if and when treatment becomes necessary, I mean, really the first key there is to assess. Make sure you know exactly what your mosquito larval levels are, what species are being produced. I mean, some species don't even prefer to bite humans. There are some species that are more anthropophilic and some that are less. And then the other thing is, within any wetland, if you've got diversity, if you've got areas that are more open water or more heavily vegetated, you will find that mosquito production is not uniform throughout that wetland. So finding where you have hotspots, if you want to think of it that way, of mosquito production, and treating those on an as-needed basis with the lowest dose and the least toxic. Now, I'm not saying don't use DTI in your wetland. That certainly is a very much less toxic approach than adulticiding or spraying organophosphates or pyrethroids. But don't just do this every 2 weeks or every 3 weeks all throughout the summer. Know what the needs are and treat those hot spots, and leave some areas untreated to maintain that prey base and to provide the refuge that other food organisms might need. Let's see, what are some other questions that we have coming in? We have a question that says, here in New York, our maximum WRP constructed pothole depth is 4 feet. Is this not deep enough to encourage dragonflies? I'm imagining, I don't know if those would end up drying down, if they would maintain permanent water or not, but thinking about the depth for most people for something like a backyard pond, you probably wouldn't get the greatest production out of something that depth. And actually, unfortunately, they weren't ready in time for this webinar. but we are also in the process of developing dragonfly habitat guidelines that can be provided to people and will be freely available when they're ready in another couple of months. But 4 feet is a little bit shallow for a maximum. That's to be really, really good habitat for odonates, I would say. Let's see, we have another question. About the asking for the genus and species of the names of the migrants because they don't know the common name. That's very funny. I usually get exactly the opposite. I use the scientific names, and people say, "Don't do that. Give me the common names." The 5 main migrants in North America, if you want their formal names, are the common green darner is Anax junius, black saddlebags is Trimia lacerata, wandering glider is Pantalus laevescens, spot-winged is Pantala hymenea, and who did I leave out? Variegated meadowhawk is Sympetrum corruptum. So for those of you who want the scientific names, there you go. And we have a question about can we recommend additional resources for those interested in odonate conservation. Definitely I can. This recorded webinar is going to be posted, and there will be information that will come out later about how to access that. And we can certainly include additional resources and links that will also help answer some of these questions. And then let's see, do we have any audio questions? Anybody that's waiting to jump in with a live question?
I am not seeing any hands raised.
Okay. So we have another question that's asking about are there any efforts to create an e-dragonfly like e-butterfly where people can report sightings? Erica Barkley, thank you so much for that question. I forgot to mention, you could think of this as sort of being the e-butterfly of odonates, or the e-bird of odonates. And this is one of the things that we'll post at the end with the recorded seminar. There is a site called Odonata Central, and basically that's the website address as well. It's www.odonatacentral.org. This was started several years ago now by an individual who is a dragonfly expert in North America. He is also a member of the Migratory Dragonfly Partnership Steering Committee, John Abbott. He's in Austin, Texas. And he did it to try to record the distribution of all the different species of dragons and damsels possible pretty much in the New World. So this is definitely a citizen science project. It is very user-friendly, and the one caveat, and I don't know if this is true of e-butterfly or e-bird, is that you have to submit a photograph along with your specimen. So there are a few people that are kind of the gods of the dragonfly and damselfly world, that if they say they saw something, we know they saw it, and it doesn't have to be accompanied by a photographic voucher. But for everybody else out there, we need to have the photographic voucher. So this is an ongoing, I think it's much better known just among people that are kind of dragonfly geeks, but certainly with the Migratory Dragonfly Partnership and Pond Watch, because that's a very place-based project, and we are asking people to record the migrant species that they see, but we're also encouraging them to report any other species that they see because dragons are going to be using their wetlands. We're encouraging them to take the photos and report those to Odonata Central. So that's another really, it's also a really good resource to check out for information and identification as well.
Les, this is Bill Holman, and I saw a question from Katie Reeder asking about the 3-mile radius and for wetland connectivity and colonization, and she was interested in what kind of documentation we have for that.
Yeah, you know what I'll do is I can include a list of PDFs. All the claims that I'm making are all supported by the science. There were a couple of studies that were actually done looking at wetlands that were with different degrees of isolation in the landscape. And so they looked at these sites, and they looked at species diversity, and they looked at colonization rates. So yes, definitely I will include that with the references. And again, that's not to say that, if you've got a wetland that's more than 3 miles away from the next nearest wetland, that you'll never ever see a dragonfly. They're good flyers. They're very mobile. But the rate of colonization is going to be lower the more isolated that wetland gets. And your ultimate, diversity of species may also be lower as well. but yeah, I will put together a little. I think we can do that, right, Bill? I can put together a little packet of PDFs that people could access as well.
Yes, definitely. We can post it as a PDF, additional resources, or if it's okay with the authors for us to post resources, published resources, we'd be happy to do that too.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay. All right, so I'm just kind of working my way back through some of the questions. We have questions about soil disturbance. What impact? Well, I guess what impact does soil disturbance have on dragonfly eggs in seasonal wetlands, and would wetland restoration activities be better at certain times of the year? That is actually a really good question. So, for example, dragonflies like the meadowhawks, which is the genus Impetrum. I'm trying to remember exactly how many species there are, 16, 18 in North America. Don't quote me on that. But they're some of the ones that tend to lay their eggs in seasonal wetlands that way. So, if you think about the seasonality of odonates, and of course this varies greatly depending on the part of the country that you're in. Here in Oregon, I see my first damselflies in April-ish, and of course that depends on the weather. And then throughout the season, they're going to be active. So, for example, if you've got a site and you're going to be doing algae control, let's just take that as an example, and it's this time of year or a couple of weeks ago or a couple of weeks from now, and you're still seeing a whole lot of damselflies that are very busily laying their eggs in that algae, it might be a good idea to wait until that period of adult activity has passed and those eggs have hatched and the nymphs are able to, to move away from those algal patches. So definitely the timing of restoration can have an impact on different species. And in some cases that becomes a trade-off between, do we have a problem with, for example, an invasive species that we absolutely have to deal with now, and down the road it's going to make the site much better habitat versus, we may kill some of the nymphs or some of the eggs that are present right now.
I have a question for you, Celeste. And in the upper Midwest, the shallow basins have been disproportionately affected by conversion to agricultural uses. And the semi-permanents and permanents have been exempt, to a little lesser extent, or affected to a lesser extent. Are you seeing that in the composition of the odonate fauna, reflecting the disproportionate effect of drainage on different wetland types?
I was at a recent presentation at the Society for Freshwater Science. I'm not sure if it's been published yet, but there was one particular state that the people were looking at. It was a Midwestern state. I'm utterly blanking on which state it was. Actually, you know what? It may have been Oklahoma. I need to check this out. But they were going back through all the historic records and the current records, and they were looking at what had been present in the state prior to a lot of hydrologic alterations, and they did see substantial shifts in species composition. So again, you may not be able to have all of that historical data to be able to go back and say, in this region or in this county or this particular agricultural area, how has our odonate species composition changed? But certainly it would have. It's been documented. It's been able to be documented in some cases a little bit better.
This is Bill again, Celeste, and that kind of leads to my next question. You talk about odonates as indicators of wetland quality, and I'm wondering at what scale are they indicators of wetland or ecosystem, wetland function? Seems like with a highly mobile species like this that they are candidates as potential landscape indicators of ecosystem function.
That's true, and of course, you can also think of looking at the nymphs, that they're confined to the habitat. So if you do nymph sampling as well as looking at adults, and again, that's not that difficult to do as far as protocols and equipment and things like that. That can also give you a good idea, not just of what's visiting the site, because again, as you say, these are very mobile, and you can get a bigger picture of landscape conditions But if you want to even get a better picture of what's going on at specific sites, you can come back to the nymphs and say, okay, well, these adults may be visiting here, they may be hunting here, but what's actually able to grow and develop successfully within, on a site-by-site basis. And we have one new question that came in that is asking, what is the significance of bullfrog tadpole predation by Odonata? I said the one study that I'm really familiar with was done here in Oregon, where bullfrogs are an invasive species, and that was the one that was looking at wetlands that either had or lacked introduced fish. And in the wetlands that lacked the introduced fish that had the odonate larvae, and I can put this as one of the PDFs to include as well afterwards, they were able to control the populations of bullfrog tadpoles. Now, of course, bullfrog tadpoles get huge. Odonate nymphs are not going to be able to handle them at a really large stage, but the hunting pressure under these conditions at these sites was sufficient that those nymphs were able to handle those tadpoles and take them out of circulation prior to them being able to develop to the size where they couldn't be handled by the nymphs at all. And of course, to be honest, the flip side of that is obviously if you have amphibians that are breeding in a habitat as well, the nymphs are generalist predators, and so they may catch tadpoles of chorus frogs or any other frogs that might be breeding at the site.
There's one other question there, Celeste, that I maybe you've answered this already, but it's from a forester asking if you have any forest management recommendations, perhaps vernal pool related.
Let me think about that. Well, again, there are some species of odes that you do find, not as many, that you do find associated more with some forested habitat. So, obviously the quality of the forest itself, being present in the landscape as refuge sites. And I've walked through wooded areas around wetlands, and they've just been dripping with darners that are perching all over the tree trunks and on fallen logs. So there certainly can be heavy use of that. As far as the vernal pools is concerned, again, yeah, you can have those being visited by some types of damselflies and some dragonflies, for example. So I'm thinking here, so I pause. So I'm trying to think about specific, vernal pool management recommendations. Obviously, control of introduced species that might be present that would simply predate on everything, water quality issues, even things like groundwater protection issues. Although for vernal pools, that's not really as much of a consideration. That's one, to be honest, that's one that I need to think about a little bit harder, and I can see if I can find some resources on that and include that with the posted final version of the webinar.
Well, Celeste, if there are no other questions, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you for an outstanding webinar. You're a veteran of this. This is your second one. And they keep getting better and better. And so thanks so much for sharing the information and kind of opening my eyes, perhaps the audience eyes, to many aspects of dragonfly biology and conservation.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for hosting this. And also, as I said, I know we're losing people, which is fine, but anybody who has any additional questions or anything they'd like to discuss further, please, my email address is there on that final question slide. Go ahead and contact me, and I would be more than happy to continue conversations with you.